The Working Artist Project is brought to you by Second Line Arts Collective. Learn how you can support at secondlinearts.org.
We're creating a platform for those who are curious, one that tells the story from the artist's perspective. Moments in time, captured from the innovators who are reshaping dance, music, theater, and the visual arts. This is the Working Artist Project.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gregory, Agid, and we'd like to welcome you all to the Working Artist Project. And we have the wonderful Darrian Douglas in the house. Darrian, how you doing?
What's up, everybody? I'm having a great week. This is one of those exciting weeks. Either my life could change or everything can stay the same, Greg. That's where I'm at today, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Darrian, I'm sorry, having a little trouble hearing you. I don't know if your volume went all the way down.
See, that's why I gotta turn my gain
Hey,
back
there
up.
you go. There you
There
go.
you go. Can you hear me? I was just saying that, I'm having a great week. This is one of those weeks where either everything can change or everything can stay the same. So I'm having a good time, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I made a tragic mistake of running this afternoon at noon in New Orleans in August,
Hey.
and not a good idea. I wouldn't recommend it. But man, I was thinking about this today, Darrian. We've been doing this every Monday for a year now.
Yep. Thank you, pandemic. Thank you. I got
Isn't that crazy? I think Jerron, we had Amari Ansari on last year, and that
Yep.
was one of the first podcasts we had. And it's like, man, we've been doing this pretty regularly.
Yeah, bro. And we not going nowhere, y'all. So keep tuning in. Send Greg a love notes on Instagram. Don't send me love notes, but send Greg love notes. He likes them. So
I probably won't respond.
just make sure y'all check out the podcast and tune in on Spotify and all the other podcast places, as well as right here on Facebook and YouTube and Twitch. We everywhere, y'all. We everywhere.
Definitely. Well, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and we have a very special guest this evening. We have a fantastic musician and the special programs coordinator here at the MACNNO, which is the Music and Culture Coalition of New Orleans. It always trips me up for some reason. And she's a fantastic musician. She spent a good portion of some time playing at the world famous Pat O'Brien's Piano Bar. She's also a fantastic trumpet player and a musical director of several musical ventures here in New Orleans. So we'd actually let's go ahead and bring on the fantastic Miss Hannah Kreiger-Benson to the Working Artist Project.
That's right, Hannah. I got all the buttons. Don't worry about it.
It's like old time radio with the special sound effect. I love it.
Darrian's actually got a bunch of people living in his living room. He's in New York. He's got like 30 roommates.
That's right. I got 50 roommates. Those are my roommates clapping back in the back. You know what I'm
Right.
saying?
That sounds very New York. Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you on. How are you doing this afternoon, Hannah?
I'm good. I in the same spirit as you, I also went for a run, and I'm still recovering from the sun in the summer here in New Orleans.
Ooh, it gets so hot out there.
So hot. But other than that, I'm great. I'm also actually on the last day of a breakthrough COVID quarantine. So as of tomorrow, I'm allowed to be around people again, which I'm very excited about.
That's right. Did you just have COVID or did you? Oh no.
I did, and thank goodness for vaccinations and mild case and all that. But yeah, no, it's been a couple week saga because my partner got it, and then I sort of we were trying to keep me from getting it, and I was testing at home every day, and then on like the 6th day, finally got a positive test, and then I did get really sick. So yeah, breakthrough Delta COVID is no joke.
Wow. Wow. I'm sorry to hear that. COVID is out here changing the landscape of what we do.
Everything.
And that's kind of the reason why we've been online for a year. Me and Greg.
We're really used to these little Zoom squares, and just like knowing people only from like here up.
Yeah, that's been quite the experience. Hopefully, at some point, we'll move back to real life, and maybe everyone will get vaccinated. Hey, everyone who watching the Working Artist Project, maybe you should consider a vaccination, or just don't leave your house ever.
Oh,
But anyways, this I don't want to make this political about whatever. Unfortunately, it's even crazy that that's a political statement to say something about a vaccine. That's nuts.
And
But let's like we'll get right into it. So, what have you been doing over this whole year with COVID? what's been your life? What's your life been like?
I love this question that we've all been asking each other. How has your pandemic been? So like everybody else, I had sort of radical pivoting in my life. You mentioned that I'm a piano player at Pat O'Brien's, although not this week because I've been at home hiding.
Is Pato's back open?
Pato's has been open for about eight weeks. Wait, time is really mushy, y'all. It might only be 7 weeks at this point, like the middle or end of June, I think. And yeah, we were kind of back at it. And then, obviously I wasn't gonna go to work once I knew I had COVID. So I didn't work this past weekend. But yeah, Pato's has been my main source of income for the last 8 years.
So for maybe those people who haven't been to New Orleans, or maybe have visited New Orleans and got so drunk that they don't remember going to Pato's, it's like one of the most iconic bars and piano music spaces in the world at this point. And I was wondering if you'd be able to tell us a little bit about what Pato's is and what you do over there.
Okay, fun fact about Pat O'Brien's. It is a dueling piano bar. As far as I understand, they invented that format back in like the 30s. And it now it's a thing that happens all over the world. You have two piano players. It's the place that invented the hurricane drink, which is the one with tons and tons of rum in it and red fruit juice and whatnot. And they're very powerful. I've only ever had like one sip of one, and I was like, okay. It's a very sort of, like you said, it's a well-known tourist spot, partly because it's been open continuously since the 30s. So we get a lot of folks who come in and we're like, hey, we were here on our honeymoon 43 years ago, all that kind of thing. I don't know this for sure. Somebody needs to write a book about the early history of Pato's because it's super interesting. But I believe it is the oldest continuous live music having business in the city. There's other buildings that have had music for longer, and other places that have kind of come and gone and whatnot, and are places that are equally as well known or as iconic, or but yeah, and it's a really incredible job. This kind of gets into as like a little sneak peek preview, talking about the whole sort of workshop that I've been doing around working musician life and all the different forms that can take. Pato's gives us a W-2 in healthcare. So it's pretty unusual in that way. So, I've been there for 8 years, which is a long time to do many kinds of jobs. But in Pato's years, it's considered, like, I'm literally still considered brand new, because people stay there for like 30, 40 years because it's so steady.
Wow.
People, buy houses and raise kids. So it's also, as a side note, the anniversary, like the day that Pato's is considered to have opened in 1933, is the day after Prohibition ended. Prohibition ended, and they were like, ta-da! We don't know where all this alcohol came from. Now we're open. We were definitely not open up until yesterday.
They certainly weren't doing that during Prohibition at all.
Definitely was not a speakeasy. I mean, like I said, somebody needs to write a book about the early history. But yeah, that was one of my favorite realizations, was when like the 80th anniversary of Pato's was the day after the 80th anniversary of the end of Prohibition. I was like, oh. So yeah, so that's Pat O'Brien, and our whole thing is we will play any song ever. It's a really unusual job in music, and in terms of sort of the actual specific combination of skills that it requires, because a lot of it is really just sort of like musical, having musical gutsiness, and just being like, yep, I'm gonna try this thing. I heard it on the radio once. I've heard my coworkers do it. I vaguely know how it goes. A lot of popular music is something that you can make recognizable if you have, kind of a solid understanding of sort of popular music theory. So I can kind of fake my way through most things. And there's, to differing degrees, I guess, how willing I am to play different things badly. There's certain music that I'm willing to kind of just like, okay, that was recognizable, that's fine. And then there's certain things, including jazz and other sort of like more sort of specialized or, virtuosic types of music, or even like artists that I really admire. Like, I don't want to do a bad job playing a Beyonce song. Like, that to me just feels terrible.
What's the most requested song at Pato's?
Piano Man, Sweet Caroline, Brown Eyed Girl, Don't Stop Believin'. And then the thing of the day is,
Oh my God.
Yeah, no, it's such a fascinating job. Like, it's amazing to see what gets asked for and what doesn't, and like what is suddenly popping up, like, 4 times a night, and you're like, what the hell is that? Like, I've never heard of it. Okay, I guess I need to learn it.
It's as you're saying all this, and you're talking about Pato's again being like a W-2 employee, that, I mean, you essentially have a career over there. You're also like working in an environment that probably would in no way reflect a career type situation. I mean, you're working late at night, surrounded by a lot of heavy drinking, and
This is like, I feel like
Street too.
You could do a whole, I know I've said this, but somebody needs to write this book. It is really fascinating. And again, with like people raising kids and, sort of buying houses and having these kind of like some of the structures that are not often as easily accessible to musicians and folks in sort of the cultural economy. But yeah, I'm working till 2 a.m. Pre-pandemic, I had a really regular schedule. I worked Sunday afternoons and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday nights until 2 a.m. And it was so normal. And I've always kind of had this dual identity, also working with MACNNO, like you said, sort of doing a lot of, daytime type of stuff. So I've always had this sort of, people who work with me in the MACNNO context know that, like, before 10, really before 11 a.m., like
don't hit me up.
Please don't. Like, please don't. Like, no, what? But also that schedule that I had meant that I kind of had the weekends free, so I could hang out with, non-musician friends who had weekday jobs, or go see friends play music or freelance in music. I've always maintained some freelancing on the side, which historically was not something that Pato's piano players were always encouraged to do, but it's something that I've always managed to do.
How do you handle, like, you are an artist in and of yourself, and again, like doing a gig like Pato's where you're playing a lot of covers and pop songs and things on the radio. Do you ever like, how do you handle that? How do you handle that? Oh, I'm hearing my echo now. How do you handle being creative and doing a job?
This question, no, it's such a good question. The way I often describe it is that job has more musical integrity than I thought it might, by which I mean it's in some ways very, very, very different than like a Bourbon Street cover band gig, because I'm not playing the radio edit version exactly the same way every time. It is, I have coworkers who kind of will modify their vocal timbre to sort of sound like the singer of the song that they're doing. They do a very different type of singing for, Billy Joel versus Elvis versus, Britney Spears or whatever. I've never done that. It's very sort of, there's a lot of autonomy, musically speaking. So it's me singing Metallica or singing, whoever, singing like 90s rap. Like it's very much me. And because of that, and because it's not, so in that way, it's really not a cover band type of gig. We definitely have at least one person, maybe only one, who was like in a cover band, like in casinos for years. And I've definitely talked to him about how it's different. So it has been, and I guess that's sort of what I meant by it. It's a really interesting and unusual sort of intersection of skills, like who likes that job and who's good at that job and who enjoys that job is a really small Venn diagram of musicians, because there's a lot of people who want to do more virtuosic stuff. Like you don't get to kind of stretch out as a piano. You know, I'm not a technically especially accomplished piano player. I don't have any kind of like studied performance background or with singing. So it is very sort of, it's something that happens to suit me really well, because, you know, I'm almost never bored. There's always, you know, it's a lot of the 80% of people are going to ask for the same few hundred songs, but there's always some weird, like weird stuff. And every once in a while you get a song, you're like, oh, cool, I'm going to kill that song. Like, let's do it. And then you get songs and you're like, oh, yeah, no, this is going to be terrible. Or you get in the middle of it and you're like, wow, this is absolutely atrocious. The thing about it is it's basically practicing, because you know, it's hours a night, a lot of the same songs over and over. I hear coworkers who are really accomplished piano players do something, you know, some interesting thing. I try it, absolutely sounds awful, doesn't matter, the audience is drunk, I'll try it again in an hour. And all of a sudden, 8 years later, I'm like a way better piano player than I used to be. And it's also, and this gets into like all kinds of other issues, it's taught me to take up space on a stage, in a room. And as a woman in music, there's a whole sort of swath of stuff there too. You know, I was still in my 20s when I started that job. And there was a ton of sort of growth for me in the not actually specifically musical parts of it, but that kind of like, you know, even when I auditioned, I remember they said like, okay, you can clearly play the piano and you know, you sing really well, but like, can you control this room full of people? Because it's a lot about, and this gets into that sort of musician life workshop that I was talking about. One of the big things I talk about is, what do we perform aside from music? We perform humor, we perform connection, we perform sexuality, we perform nostalgia, all these things. And that kind of, you know, taking up space and commanding the room and sort of curating and crafting people's experience and leading people through an experience has been just, I think I can't even measure how good that's been for me. And in an interesting sort of, I guess, coincidence, right around the time I started at Pato, about maybe like 6 or 8 months before that, is when MACNNO sort of formed by accident. And early MACNNO was weekly community meetings, which through a kind of accidental process I ended up leading. And I was, you know, this sort of 20-something-year-old like person who was, you know, with this incredibly steep learning curve. So I, in like 2012, 2013, and then going forward from there, I sort of had this crash course in learning to take up space and command a room as a young woman. And it wasn't until a number of years later that I really sort of noticed how those two things like fit together and literally shaped the way I approach the world. I mean, in terms of, you know, my own confidence and just ability to kind of, I guess, be effective.
Do you mind backing up, since we're here at
No.
MACNNO, and kind of tell the people what MACNNO stands for, and also what the mission of MACNNO is?
Absolutely. And Greg, when you were trying to sort of, you know, spell it out, it's a name that was chosen by committee in these weekly meetings in 2012, and it reads that way. It's the Music and Culture Coalition of New Orleans, which doesn't really mean anything. And over the years, we've really gotten away from using the full name because MACNNO itself has kind of gained this name recognition. So what MACNNO is this tiny little nonprofit that sits, as we say, at the intersection of culture and policy. And it's all of the different ways that law and policy impact music and culture. And that sounds really sort of disconnected from real life, or sort of, you know, nerdy in a way that's not, you know, I often talk about how we do all the really unsexy things like zoning law. But what that means in practice is stuff like law enforcement interactions with street performers, which can be incredibly problematic. We get a lot of calls about that. It's stuff like, where can you perform live music? Like the ways that live music is regulated under the legal system are incredibly frustrating in a number of ways. And our stickers, for anybody, I guess, listening in New Orleans, if you've ever seen them, they say music is not a crime. And I love finding them all over the city on people's cars and recycling bins and whatever.
So MACNNO is responsible for those stickers?
We made those in like 2012 or 13 or 14. Yeah, I love seeing them. And people are always like, that's like, what does that even mean? Like, of course, music is not a crime. And there's this sort of invariable conversation that, we've all had over and over and over, where it's like, unfortunately, the way the laws are written, a lot of music is actually directly against the law. And people are like, well, that's insane. Like, this is New Orleans. The whole economy is built on the culture. And like, it's what makes New Orleans. It's like this very sort of predictable sort of cycle of outrage and incredulousness that people go through when I sort of talk about this. But unfortunately, that's the reality, is that the laws on the books are often not at all accommodating to or nurturing of cultural practices. And cultural practices often grow up sort of without being aware of the laws on the books, or, it just sort of never was brought up. And then, of course, what you've had post-Katrina in particular is the sort of the combination of a spotlight, an international spotlight being shown on the city, people moving into neighborhoods where maybe they had not lived before. And all of a sudden you have these direct conflicts with cultural practices and people and places, and people who have issues with cultural people and practices and places, realizing that the law is actually favoring them in terms of shutting things down. And that's kind of a very short and cynical version. So the thing I talk about a lot is we do a lot of like putting out fires, like, oh, this music venue is getting sued by a neighbor. This place is, struggling with permitting around this. This street performer was harassed by a law enforcement agent who misquoted the law or, trampled on their rights, putting out fires. But then the other piece of it is making the landscape less flammable, like really trying to work on the underlying stuff. And to give sort of a very concrete example of that, and again, this is where it gets like into the unsexy, the comprehensive zoning ordinance, every city, almost every city, I think, has one. It's a very normal thing, and it just kind of dictates what you can do where in a city. That's, basically what zoning law is. And in 2015, they overhauled it and they updated it. And among other things, and this is just like a really tiny example, a business that was zoned as a restaurant could have live music, but only up to a trio and unamplified. So you could have a trio of tubas, but you could not have a singer with a mic. You weren't ready for the tuba trio. I got you there.
That was good. That was good.
But if you're a singer and like you need a microphone so you don't blow out your voice, like it's a very ordinary thing. But legally, you could not have a microphone if you were a singer with, a guitarist and a bassist in a restaurant. So we were able to get that language taken out in the 2015 update. And the MACNNO is three people. It's me, and then a guy named Renard Bridgewater, who's also a performer. He's a hip hop MC and also a hip hop scholar. He runs the first ever hip hop show that WOZ has ever had, which, I just want to give him a shout out for that. It's awesome. And he's our community engagement coordinator. And then Ethan Elistad, who is the executive director. And Ethan is basically probably one of the most expert people in the country about zoning law and culture, just sort of by accident, because nobody does this work. Like nobody has sort of the mix of interest and the inclination and the expertise. So Ethan is not a performer, but he's really, really expert on this kind of stuff. So because we were sort of paying attention and we saw this opportunity, we got that language, that restrictive language taken out. So restaurants can have music simply restricted by the sound level. And in some cases, like the time of day, depending on the zoning, you might have but having it restricted by sound level and time of day is so much better than having it restricted in any way by like the type of sound producing devices, because that just gets into this like terrible, stupid, slippery slope that absolutely does not work.
I mean, I would have been cool if y'all would have changed it to like outlawing 3 sousaphones in a trio setting.
I do want to interject and just say this, because some people might be listening to this, because most of our listeners are not in New Orleans. So So people might be listening to this and be like, why is this important? And as a musician, I'll tell you why. It's because in a place like New Orleans, you got a lot of people moving into the city who aren't from New Orleans. So if, for instance, if you move from Idaho, you expecting your neighborhood to be quiet at night. But but if you move to the French Quarter, this expectation is bullshit. And so you can't really, you need organizations like MACNNO to advocate on the musicians' behalf, so that, musicians aren't shut up because the police, like she said, the police will come in, you got to shut up, we got this law. The MACNNO comes in and says, well, actually they don't got to shut up until midnight, so play on. And that's kind of why it's important. Is that they're basically, they advocate on the musicians' behalf so that the musicians can keep the culture of that particular place alive.
I would love to work myself out of that job. I would love if there was no more work to do. Like, I would so happily like, okay, cool, we solved it. And I wanted to talk about like, Darrian, your wording there was I thought so important. You're like, why is this important? And that's exactly what I mean when I talk about it not being sexy, or about it sort of not seeming relevant. Like, MACNNO exists, and I sort of mentioned that like in our origin story, it kind of formed by accident, and it totally did. It grew out of the series of community meetings that grew out of a meeting called by trumpet player Kermit Ruffins to talk about, some music venues that had been told by the city that they couldn't have live music because their permitting wasn't in order. But there's this gap. There's this, and this is true in a number of different sort of areas of life. There's a gap between legal and power systems and sort of people who have access to that stuff and who know that stuff. And then the gap between that and then the people who are experts in terms of like their lived experience. So like between legal people and structures, and then musicians. I'm not explaining that super well, but that gap is where MACNNO sits, and we bridge that gap, and we, and it's a bunch of things. It's taking, like, the city says, okay, we have changed this ordinance to say blah. It's taking that and making it accessible. It's taking that and making it relevant and saying, hey, this is practically what this could mean. And then it's also the other way around. The sort of two-way channel of communication is making sure that the concerns of the community get channeled directly to the people who are in power, because what happens is there is, historically not a lot of direct representation of what anybody in the cultural community wants in terms of crafting law or policy, which is why you get these laws that are at best misguided and at worst probably malicious because of people who are like, no, I just want, and to be like super, I guess, transparent about it. A lot of that is racism, like straight up, if we're talking about kind of that gap in terms of who has access to power, there's tons of stuff there around race and class. And that, obviously is true of all politics as well.
Yeah, it's crazy. As you're talking about all of this, like, I'm having flashbacks of 2012 to that. There was like this, I feel like there were a couple eras after Katrina that happened. There was like, this like, just again cleaning up, there was the rebuilding, then there was like a couple different scenes of musicians that happened. In 2012, I believe that's like when Bacchanal was going through like all these zoning issues. Frenchmen Street had a bunch of zoning issues, and yeah, what you're saying too is like directly, with racism, and it's just crazy again when you think about people coming, like, say the word gentrification, but people from new communities coming to a place like New Orleans that has a very an indigenous population that has a routine and a strong culture. And again, what Darrian was saying is some people don't want that. And unfortunately, when you have money, and if you're a lawyer moving from California or wherever, New York, and you can come on down and how to change those laws, and how to get in direct contact with the politicians, and you're probably hanging out with them at the country club at the Ritz on the Friday night and stuff. versus all of us here in New Orleans who are just trying to make music.
And that's that gap. That's that information gap and that empowerment gap. And like, we talk a lot about that, and just, translating stuff, as it's needed. And something you just said also, like, you know how to change those laws if you have sort of access to certain types of information and whatnot, but you may not even have to change them. And that kind of gets back to the, like, music is not a crime, is that the laws on the books are so unfriendly to music and culture. And Bacchanal is a really good example. And for anybody who's listening, who's not, here in town, it's this space, this sort of, it was sort of a wine bar with a big outdoor space, and they had some live music. And then there was this whole massive sort of pushback against them from some neighbors who didn't like the sound levels, and that was all sort of going on just before MACNNO formed. So that was not one that I ever had any kind of like sort of involvement or even like a sort of any insight into, aside from sort of like what everybody knows. But it kind of still stands as like one of the the strongest examples of a spot kind of just going through hell. And I mean, the fact is, and I try to always be really to make sure I say this, because people are like, well, what about quality of life and this and that. Neighborhoods and cities change and evolve, like they do. The question then becomes, who gets to decide and arbitrate and declare what is good change and what is bad change? And we know who that is. We know it's people who have access to privilege and power, and they're like, this is what I think is good, and what I think is good is now I'm going to declare it's objectively good, and write it into law. And that's obviously part of the problem, because and this is another thing that I talk about a lot with MACNNO for sure, is this difference between legally regulating something and socially regulating it. And what I mean by that is a lot of cultural practices, especially if they kind of just grew up organically, like almost anything that grew organically, even like, let's take early Frenchmen, because I've been doing a lot of sort of research on the history of that. Things that grow organically have nuance that can be so incredibly hard to legally regulate after the fact. Like, you cannot craft a law that has sort of the same effect as like the kind of verbal agreement that the bar on the corner has music on Thursdays, most Thursdays, if Mr. Joe feels like playing, and they're going to stop, kind of whenever. And if Miss Betty next door like asks them to stop, and they might stop, like and maybe maybe on once in a while, it's not on a Thursday, it's on a Tuesday, because that like, you cannot legally regulate that stuff. It's too complex. And what happens is the complexities of cultural practices that grow organically just get sort of ignored or erased or squashed. But I guess I just want to acknowledge the very, very real challenges in then, the city kind of playing catch up all the time. Frenchmen Street's a great example. It grew organically through the 70s and 80s. And then in 1992, they proposed a zoning overlay that would basically make what was already there legal, because it was technically not. And the zoning overlay was not passed for 12 years. It didn't pass till 2004, at which point it was immediately obsolete because of how many things had opened up in the meantime. Like, you literally cannot, like, you're always playing catch up if you're trying to legally regulate things that have grown organically. And this is one of my most, I guess, common rants that I like to go on, because it's always an issue. But the thing that I always talk about is our laws reflect what we value, and we need to have legal language that doesn't just treat music, like, at best right now it's like a nuisance. Like, if it's not a crime, it's like a nuisance, and it's something to be kind of squashed and managed and regulated. We need to have legal language that nurtures and not just protects and preserves in like the sort of the past sense, but leaves room for growth and nurturing and honoring the cultural practices and places and people.
That's such an important thing here in New Orleans too, because at the end of the day, people come to New Orleans for the music, for the food, and for the party. And when you remove that, this is not a place you want to be.
So, but dig this. I want to play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay.
All right. So say I'm a New Orleanian. I live where I live. I live on Frenchman Street, and the street is how it is now, and maybe it's going to change more. But I want the music to stop at a certain time, so I complain this and that. Do I also get a voice? Like, where is my voice in the mix? I think that's kind of what happened at Bacchanal. I love Bacchanal, and I think it's one of the greatest places to go in the world, and everybody should go there. But back in like 2010 or whenever they were going through that stuff, I think those guys the neighbors were already there. It wasn't like they moved there. MACNNO came after them. And so that's annoying as shit. Like, like if you own a house, like my neighbors down like a half a mile away, I saw that they're building a Popeyes behind their house. I was like, oh, that's fucked up. I don't want to smell chicken every day. But like, what do you do in that situation? Do you want Popeyes behind your house? No.
So that's a super important point, and I'm really glad you said that, because it's something that I always try to make sure that I center in these conversations, is that I'm not at all trying to be dismissive of quality of life concerns, because it can really devolve into that. And the other thing that I also like so try to avoid is the who was there first thing, because it can just devolve into that, and that's not at all productive. And that's what I was sort of trying to get at when I was saying cities and neighborhoods change and evolve. Like, that's just a fact. Who gets to decide what's good and what's bad? That's exactly the point, is, things are going to keep changing. And one thing, of course, is, the science of sound is not even all that well understood. And it's often, and I am in no way a sound scientist, but I feel like a lot of us who sort of work in the space have kind of gotten this crash course in like at least the basic understanding of the fact that the science of sound is complicated, and it's often sort of misquoted, or, and so, if you're someone who's living on Frenchmen Street and you've watched Frenchmen Street change and evolve in some like really crazy ways, first of all, there are decibel limits in the zoning code. So if things are, if it's a question of, what am I trying to say? One thing I try to do is really like try to separate out the different threads. Like, what is actually the problem? Is it that there is sound that is in a place where there was not sound before? Is it that it is louder? Is it that it's a different type of music? And now we get into that really slippery issue of like trying to arbitrate by type of music, which is like such a no-no, because that will never, ever, ever sort of be legally possible. Like, you absolutely cannot bring that kind of judgment into it, because again, there's just too many power imbalances. But you know what I'm saying? Like, really sort of pulling apart the threads of like, not just, oh, who was there first, but like, what is it? Because, and this is one thing that comes up a lot, is people are like, well, I can hear it. And audibility, like being able to hear something, is not necessarily the basis for, a legal complaint. Like, there's a certain amount, a certain level up to which it being heard is not a problem. And this is something I talk about, and this again gets into these issues of privilege. Like, people who are very privileged, they hear something and they don't want to hear it. They didn't hear it before. And the description I often use is people who are very privileged then kind of pick up the legal system and use it as a hammer against things they don't like, and they just kind of, bash it. But your point about, do people's complaints, deserve consideration? Absolutely. Like, it's not at all, we used to sort of have this joke that like, there was a sort of one neighborhood, neighborhood association, this sort of advocacy organization in the French Quarter. And we used to kind of joke that like, what they thought MACNNO was trying to do was like install trombone players in everybody's living room. And we're like, we're really not. Trios of tubas.
Sousaphone trios.
Like, honestly, I promise that's not it. The problem is that there are such historical power imbalances, and this gets into, when I say like that race comes into it and all these other things. Like, there is this assumption that music, like live music and cultural practices, are sort of automatically wrong. And so that power imbalance is so great that, yes, MACNNO tends to be leaning pretty heavily on the side of both people's legal rights and also sort of right to do cultural things in like a not quite legal sense, but like a sort of, whose quality of life, who gets to kind of dictate like what is a good quality of life and all that stuff. So keeping that, keeping validity there while also not letting, wealthy, entitled people, not letting entitled people shape the landscape solely in the image of what they think is good. Like, that's the tricky part. But
yeah,
Darrian,
I love what you were saying earlier too about, again, just like, Joe's bar, and then the neighbor is, can walk over and just say, hey, like, the music's going a little too late tonight. Can y'all cut it off? Or next Tuesday, can y'all not have music? Again, like these New Orleans, I feel like one of the things that makes New Orleans a very special city is like everyone knows everyone on the block. Everyone knows the bar owner down the street. You say what's up, you say hi to people. And sorry, just on this aside, it pisses me off when I say hi to people and they don't even acknowledge me. And I'm like, man, go back to wherever you're from. We don't need you here. But
as a northerner, I can say it took me like a solid 6 months to not do "Ugh," when someone said hi to me. Like when I moved here when I was 22, and I was just like, what? No, don't talk to me, go away. And then and now I do it. Like I go up north and I'm like, hey, hi, hey, hello,
oh yeah.
hi.
You're in New York City, like, hey everybody, what's going on? Hey, what's up?
That's right.
But yeah, it's like, there's that power of that handshake deal too, because it built. I think that's like ultimately what strengthens communities too. Is been like, being, when you have an issue with your neighbor, you walk next door, you say something, you have a conversation, you work it out, as opposed to, fuck you, and then 3 days later there's like they're being served legal papers, and then that's when you have a real problem.
Right.
And
like, yeah, it's, but Darrian's point about like, what about the validity of people who, have noticed a change in their lived environment that they really either just really hate or is, genuinely disruptive in some way. Like that is a real thing, and how to sort of honor that. And, unfortunately, all too often it's been kind of tipped way too far one way. And, sort of trying to like rebalance that without erasing those concerns about quality of life. Like that's why it's so tricky. And I really do try to say, like, as often as I can in conversations about sound and shared space, that, I'm not dismissive of quality of life concerns. It's been an interesting moment sort of over this past year, which is that I live within faintly sound range of the Broadside, and I can usually hear what they're, whatever's going on there. And I think it kind of depends on the wind or whatever, because some nights it's like much more clear, but I think it also depends on, the level of the sound being produced and how sound carries. But I've had moments of thinking about that, like, okay, now I'm the one who can hear. And again, for me, it's been in a way that I really enjoy. But if I was, several blocks closer, I don't know. I mean, I've wondered about the people who live a couple blocks closer as well. The other thing I just wanted to kind of throw in there, and this is like, like the deep nerd, is just the note that New Orleans itself is a city where sound carries. I mean, there's the sort of maybe true and maybe not true story of Buddy Bolden blowing his horn so loudly that people could hear it all the way across town as a way to like call people over to the dance where he was going to play.
We also have to take into consideration, here in New Orleans, people play as the loudest in the world.
That's true.
I mean, but also this, like the landscape itself, and this is, again, it kind of gets beyond my own, anything that I feel comfortable talking about with any kind of expertise or fluency, but I want someone else to like write this book, I guess. New Orleans is flat. New Orleans is surrounded by water. These are all things that make sound carry. New Orleans has old buildings which are low. Like there's all these things where like the landscape itself is conducive to sound. And again, coming from up north, inside and outside are really fluid in this climate. Like, Darrian, you're in New York, like in the summer, maybe less so, you could be sitting on a patio or something, but like for a good chunk of the year, if you're inside, you're inside. If you're outside, you're outside. And I remember like coming down, to this like semi-tropical world and being like, oh, you can kind of be outside. You're like under a covering, but there's no walls, or like you're at a second line parade. Oh, and now you've gone into a bar, but now you've gone back outside. So like inside and outside is really fluid. And the landscape itself is really conducive to sound carrying in certain ways. And then of course you have something like, the Claiborne Overpass Bridge, which when it was built completely disrupted the historic Black Treme, but then has become part of the landscape, and it's where the bands go to like show off and play loudly, and like they use it as an amphitheater, and it's the sort of incredible feature of the physical musical landscape. And I feel like I'm just sort of ranting about
I was
sound.
just gonna listen. If your ass
Bring back.
if your ass don't like loud music, move to Metairie. Because and don't come to New York either, because I can hear my neighbors chewing Cheerios. So you go,
Oh,
just
wow,
don't.
they're doing Cheerios. That's
They chewing
terrible.
them, they chewing them. These walls, man, I feel like they paper thin. But yeah,
Uh,
the sound thing, I get it. I get it. It can be annoying, especially if you're not from the place, and then you move into a place trying to absorb the culture, which takes time. And then some guys out front your house with 10 of his friends playing tubas and trombones and saxophones and bass drums and snare drums. That's a lot, man. But at the same time, you gotta respect the culture, and
yeah.
and that's the piece that I think when people move from anywhere to somewhere new, is they forget that place had a culture before you. It's gonna have a culture after you. So the first thing you gotta do is check your ego and say, okay, how can I be a part of the culture versus like trying to change the culture to what it was in Idaho. You know what I'm saying?
That's, and the thing is too, what you're saying. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about all this stuff too, but like New Orleans, I feel like in the last 10 years has become like a Disneyland type situation too, where like every weekend there's a festival. There's so many more venues than there were 10 years ago. Everyone is playing all the time, and so sometimes as someone who lives in the city, I feel overwhelmed by the fact I'm like, man, there's another party like this weekend down the street. What's going on? Like, or it's not even a party, but like again, like an organized event. There's crawfish festival. There's beignet festival. There's coffee festival. There's chicken festival. There's everything happening. So I guess in defense of everyone living in the city, it's definitely
Single food item festivals make me laugh. It's
what's
just like the Creole tomato and the fried chicken and the gumbo. Like every like food item now has a festival, and I just think it's really funny. The word you said, the word Disneyfication or Disney, Disneying. Like I think that's really important. That gets tossed around a lot, and people sort of toss it around, in ways that I sort of agree with, and ways that I don't. But it really, to me, I think comes back to this idea that like things are going to change and evolve over time.
yeah.
How do we make sure that they're changing in ways that nurture and preserve what we like? And while also like mitigating harm or whatever. So I feel like, yeah, just that, because people talk about like, oh, New Orleans was not the same as it was in whatever year or whatever year before that or whatever year before that, and like yeah, things have changed over time, and there's any number of things that like I wish had been done differently, especially after the storm, to sort of to recognize how like things have played out in ways that were really predictable, but were just sort of like there wasn't like the thought or the resources necessarily to take the actions then that could have changed it. So yeah, the Disneyfication thing, I guess part of me just hates to hear that, because I'm like, no, it's still here and it's still real.
Mm-hmm.
And
I appreciate what you said too. Like change is the only constant too, and I guess on some level we all have to be flexible and embrace the fact that it's always changing, and we can either change with it or we can get left in the dust and complain about it for the rest of our life. But yeah, we have a couple of minutes left here, but something that Darrian and I both would really looking forward to is having you come and hang at our camp, or another opportunity to work with some of our students. And you've been doing these wonderful presentations about life as a working musician. And I was wondering if maybe you could share a couple thoughts from your presentation, or some of these things that you have been meditating on to share with this next generation of cats.
I would love to. And yeah, I've gotten to now do this twice with the students from the Trombone Shorty Foundation, which was so much fun and so interesting. And then again, which is very different, with a class of Tulane students who are not musicians, but interested in sort of the economics of like of creative economy. So it was like a much more sort of zoomed out, I guess a different type of nerd. We're all nerds. But the general sort of overview of this workshop that I've been just sort of developing, it's been kind of just like bouncing around in my head for years, and I finally have started to kind of externalize it, is let's like talk about what it means to be a working musician. Let's talk about all the things that don't, one version is like, what are all the things that we don't learn in music school? And it gets back to the kind of like what I mentioned before about like all the things we perform that are not music, performing humor, performing sexuality, and like how that plays out as a woman in music, and like, you know, all these things. And one of the exercises that I do in this workshop is talk about all the different types of careers that you can have. And, you know, with the trombone shorty kids, I mean, they were young people. They were from like 12 to I think like 22 or something. You know, I kept saying like fame does not equal success. Success does not equal fame. You can be the bass player of a wedding band and work really steadily and make a really great living. I mean, you know, I'm not famous under my own name. Pat O's is famous, but I'm sort of, there's like, that's sort of like anonymous but successful thing, which a lot of times I think doesn't get untangled consciously enough. And I want all like young musicians to do some really good thinking about that, because, you know, you can be a band leader, you can be a sideman. Being a really good sideman requires a whole different skill set. Being a really good band leader requires a skill set. Being a band leader versus being the front person of a band, that's like, a lot of times those get conflated. You know, and then there's so many other models, you know, being a music educator or having another job that is sort of in music. You know, an example that I use is like a couple of years ago, 2 bands that I'd been in for a really long time, one for 8 years, one for 4 years. One of them sunset, and one of them I was asked to leave. Like, it was not my choice to leave it. And I had this like sort of complete meltdown. Like, I'm not even a musician. And somebody, I don't remember who it was, but somebody at the time was kind of like, you still make your living playing piano and singing on the stage every night. I was like, oh yeah. And it was like Pat O's was sort of like the day job in that way. Like it, you know, and like you were talking about earlier, sort of it not being as maybe as musically fulfilling. But you know, that kind of thing, or you know, being in a wedding band or working on a cruise ship or working in a casino. Like there's so many, or you know, the pit orchestra on Broadway. Like, you know, what if you're the music director for Cirque du Soleil? Like there's so many jobs in music. And so that's kind of the whole first part of the workshop, is just like talking about all the different, you know, and I use all these sort of different real life examples. And, you know, I was talking to the trombone shorty guys and I was like, okay, let's talk about, you know, fame and success. I was like, trombone shorty, famous? Yeah. Successful? Yeah. I was like, what about trombone shorty saxophone player? We were like, is he famous? No. Is he successful? Yeah. I was like, yeah. And that's a guy named Dan Ostreicher who I then ran into a few days later. I was like, just so you know, you were an example in my workshop the other day. And he was like, wait, what? Like, yeah, sorry, buddy. Like, I guess that's now, since I've been developing this workshop, I guess that's now like a hazard of knowing me is, you know, your life might end up.
You're going to be in the workshop.
Yeah. But you know, but like you could see these guys thinking like they'd never really thought about this before. They were like, okay, fame does not equal success, you know. And then we talked about all these other things that you perform aside from music, you know, all these other things that I talked about. And the performing sexuality is one that, you know, one of the ways I sort of came to this whole thing was by doing a lot of researching and thinking and writing about tipping and the history of tipping and what it means and how that plays out, particularly for women in music, and you know, sort of what it means to be, and you know, there's some real issues around, yeah, that sort of need to perform sexuality. And again, with you know, people being an example, I know a drummer who is a woman, and she tells this story about being asked to walk the tip bucket around, which is, you know, a way that you kind of get more tips is by kind of putting this in people's faces. And a lot of times women get asked to do it because there's this kind of flirtatiousness that's, you know, sort of built into it. And hustling for tips is its own skill set. It's like an entirely separate skill set. And I always sort of talk about that. Like, you know, if you are doing this, you are doing music, and you are also doing this other thing that like doesn't get acknowledged as its own thing. So this drummer, she was like literally asked to walk the tip bucket, and she was like, my boobs are more important than the beat. Like, I'm literally getting off stage right now while the rest of the band plays. Like, basically like, fuck y'all. Like, she was so angry. And then of course, you know, somebody was like, hey, smile. And she like, it was just, you know, it's amazing. She didn't kill anybody. But that anecdote always just sticks with me as like, even if you're, you know, not on stage performing, because a lot of times if there is a woman on stage, there's very, very often just one, and she's very often the singer slash front person. And, you know, being a side person as a woman, and I could, you know, spend another hour talking about gender and music. I've done a ton of like thinking and sort of trying to, you know, get my head around this. Let's see, what else is in this workshop? We talk about kind of the width of your wheelhouse, versatility versus virtuosity. God, that's hard to say. And like, you know, what does that mean?
Ooh, I love that. Versatility versus virtuosity. That is killing.
Yep.
I never thought about that.
See, like thinking about things that we don't often think about, like thinking about the underlying structures of things is, I would say, one of my favorite things to do and one of my strong suits. I
So Hannah, dig this.
Yeah.
You know, this is one of my, I love this conversation. This is my shit. Greg already knows. I think I think university is bullshit, but that's a different conversation. But I think one thing that musicians never learn, and they should absolutely learn from day one, one of the most important things is storytelling. And then maybe the second most important thing, if maybe the first two firsts, is financial literacy. Because think about Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Apple. Like, what do they do? I was just talking to my wife. I was like, remember when Apple told us that we needed to have 1,000 songs in our pocket? And everybody was like, nah, I don't need that. 1 year later, we all needed it. I used to be cool with 5 CDs. And then like they said, you know what you need? You need 1,000 songs in your pocket. And I was like, damn, I need it. And I need to pay $500 for it. You know what I mean? Musicians need that ability. Like if you ask a musician, like, okay, cool, tell me about this product you're trying to sell me, which is your music, which is your CD, which is whatever the fuck it is you're creating. They're just like, I don't know. You know, like I play good and shit. And you know, you're just like, bruh, no one cares. No one cares that you can play. Guess what? Everybody can play.
Everybody can play.
What is your story? And then, okay, you got a good story.
And that, I mean, that's so central to it is, yeah, how do you get, and this kind of gets back to like these gaps, like why MACNNO exists in this like this gap between like legal and culture folks. There's a gap between like financial knowledge and financial experts in this and that and cultural people and financial structures and systems. And it's something that I wanted to do through MACNNO for years, is like financial literacy workshops. And we did one back in April and it was so good. Like it went off so well because people were like, yes, like I want to know these things. And one of the things that we did was have some musicians talk. So it wasn't just like, oh, this lady from the bank or this guy who's a CPA. It was, here are some of your peers, like, you know, these people, and they're telling you like what they do as band leaders, or like how they keep a written list of whatever, to try to make it more accessible, because they're really, and it's only made more insane by the fact, not insane, that's the wrong word. It's made more, the gap is just widened by the fact that, for good or for bad, in New Orleans, even more, I think, than other places, there's a at least partly cash economy, and all that stuff, all the business structures kind of just go out the window when it's a cash economy, because you don't need them. And then you can't get, I mean, and it happened with the pandemic, like, oh my God, people were not able to access resources because they hadn't done taxes, or they didn't have an LLC, or they, you know, didn't have the like backlog of stuff that they needed to access. And so this is one of the things I told the trombone shorty students, as I was just like, put your shit on paper in some form, like whatever it is, whether you make an LLC, whether you just like keep a written list of your gigs. You know, we're a 2 musician household, and I was like helping my partner, like he keeps track, you know, he uses a paper planner, God bless him. And he keeps track of all of his gigs and like how much money he made, but we were like assembling it into a spreadsheet so that he could then use that to like give to, I don't know, Jazz and Heritage or somebody to try to get money. You know, it was just this kind of like, put your shit on paper.
You know, the thing is, Greg and I have been teaching this exact class since 2016, every summer at the Sanaa Music Workshop. And, you know, it's something that the kids think, they think is boring. And so 1 year, what I did was, because I'm a spreadsheet guy, and so I got spreadsheets from every gig probably that I've ever played. And so I just pulled it up. I was like, all right, so this was 2015 and I made X. And then this year, I made a bunch of money. Look, and and it's like I know every gig I've ever played and how much I've made every year. There's trends. It's like, oh yeah, this is when you're gonna make all the money. This is gonna be slow. It's the same every year in, year out, no matter who you're playing with. That's the vibe. So this shit is important. So keep
It's
keep keep
I'm
keep
so
on
glad you
keeping on.
did this. No, you guys too. I was so happy when I sort of reconnected with Greg, and just to realize what you guys have been doing is it's so good. I'm so glad that more people are starting to. It's like like you said, in the last 5 years. But yeah,
It's really that combination too. Is like, again, like in the last 10 years, so much has changed with the internet, and the end of the music industry as we used to know it, or as we were taught in school and things like that. And it really comes down to like our generation and future generations will be responsible for all aspects of their life, and that's probably going to translate into other fields too, not just music in the future. So it's I think it's really important to just approach this music education as like a full integration of like you're a musical business. And I think that's also, again, like why a working artist. And you mentioned, again, like you're a working musician, and to me it's like if you ain't working, I don't know what you're doing.
But in some ways, like, I always try to make it really clear that like I haven't done the freelance hustle in years because of this piano bar job. Like I sort of found a relatively, I'd say the closest thing to what I do would be somebody who is in like a steady wedding band or a casino or a cruise
Touring
ship.
act or something.
Yeah.
Or playing with Michael Bublé.
Yep.
Playing with Michael Bublé. Like, you want to talk about fame versus success. Like, I feel like that's perfect. Yeah. Touring with a big name. So, I also try to like be very, I guess, I always try to be very upfront about my own limitations in terms of expertise, because I never want to speak, in a way where I don't actually have the expertise to back it up. So I try to be very clear that like, yep, I made this choice and I don't do the freelance hustle, but I have done it and I know it and I understand it. And, I want everyone else to do it really well.
Yeah, I guess, and that's why we really want to, to me, the goal of education too is to provide options that you may not have been provided had you not gotten this education. And if you want to be a freelance musician, like there's nothing wrong with that. But I think what again, like with the goal of all these programs that you all are doing at MACNNO and what we're doing here is, again, like if you do want to make that transition, it's important to have the skills. Like, first of all, know it's possible, and then know how to make that transition. And that's really what's important and necessary in our city.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, bro, it's a lot here, man. Hannah. I can't.
Warned you, I talk in long tangents.
Yeah, I'm with it. I can't wait to get you over at Sanaa Music Workshop and
That's
to,
so
to
exciting.
to blow our kids' minds. Hopefully, we got you #1 on the list for next summer, and
Yay.
and maybe for some of our other programs that we're planning to go through the year. But listen, it's been beautiful talking to you. And before, we kind of reaching our time here, but before we go, do you have any links or places people can connect with you? And how can they support MACNNO and everything else, all the other nonprofit organizations that you're
All
involved
right,
with?
your musician self-promotion time. Here we go. So MACNNO is just macno.com, MACCNO.com. If you are curious about our work, you can get in touch through there, sort of read about some of the stuff that we've done, or, donate, please, always. And for me personally, let me see. I'm on, I don't do social media that much, but I am on Instagram at Hannah BKB, HANNAH BKB. And one project that I absolutely want to shout out that I've been just loving so much is this weekly burlesque show called the Van Ella Bordella, which is sort of a theatrical immersive thing. It's basically like you are in a Storyville brothel in like 1910. And everybody, plays a character. There's the madam and all the dancers, all the dancing girls. And then I am the piano professor, which, again, playing with gender, because historically those were most often men. And so I sort of, do this kind of gender bending part. And then I sort of play all this background music. And And the music is not at all necessarily off in that period, but it's so much fun, and it's this hilarious show, and it's just wonderful. So you can find the Van Ella Bordella on Instagram as well. And that is that's a weekly show. So please come see us any Thursday at the Always Lounge. And
that sounds like so much fun.
it's so like I just sit there at the piano and just like laugh. Like these women are, I mean, talk about performing they're performing dancing and they're performing humor and they're performing sexuality. Like they are so incredibly talented. It is the most fun. And yeah, I love it. So yeah, please come any week. And yeah, that's me. If anybody, please get in touch, sort of from the MACNNO side, or just musically speaking. I don't get to play that much trumpet these days, but I still do a little bit, and it's so much fun. And I feel so lucky. I've sort of stumbled into this very unusual life in a lot of ways. Like you said, the kind of weird juxtaposition of like a kind of career job at this piano bar, but I'm also working till 2 a.m. and all this stuff. Like my life is very unusual. Like the structures of my life are very unusual, but I feel so incredibly lucky to get to do all the things I do, and I love it. So I'm glad I get to come here and talk about it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I learned so much over the last hour, and again, like what Darrian said, we'd love to have you when we have our kids back at some point in the coming months. So,
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. So my name is Darrian Douglas.
And my name is Gregory Agid. And Hannah, thank you so much for joining us.